Right, now we can speak to Sanusha Naidu, who's researcher at the Institute for Global Dialogue. That's a South African think tank. She's joining us from Cape Town. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Africa has the largest number of displaced people. That includes refugees and internally displaced people in the world. The causes of people moving away from home, of course, are many. Conflict is one of them. Economic deprivation is another. And, of course, repression. Do you think the African Union is prepared, willing or capable of dealing with these core issues?
Good afternoon. I think it's a really massive task and agenda for the African Union, particularly given the fact that the African Union has to deal with its internal resourcing crisis as well, in terms of capacity, dealing with the fact that it has to also create the AU reform agenda. And of course, it's just also ratified and announced the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. All of the issues that you've highlighted are actually synergetic. They link to each other. So it's the repression, the internal domestic issues of what we've heard in the inset around refugees, internally displaced people who are fleeing conflict at a domestic level. It's also the question of economic migration. It's also the question of climate change and how climate change affects in terms of humanitarian crisis. So right now, the African Union has to deal with its own internal capacity and whether or not it's able to address these structural conditions that exist, which are also systemic and systematic. I think it's really a massive task for the AU. And right now, I think the AU finds itself in a difficult position.
With regard to this specific issue, I'm just wondering what difference might be made from learning that the AU is restructuring itself, as you alluded to, moving the issue of refugees and IDPs away from political affairs and to a new department for health and humanitarian issues. I mean, is that encouraging, do you think?
I think it's encouraging, but I think you can't ignore the cross-cutting nature of refugees and internally displaced people. I mean, as one of your interviewees said, you can't deal with the crisis by just trying to concentrate on the health, the socioeconomic, etc., because there are contagion effects. It's synergetic. So if there's conflict in one country, we must also bear in mind that you've got to deal with the security architecture. And one of the things that the AU does have and should be implementing and putting into some kind of efficacy effort into is the standby capacity force. They talk about this AU capacity building structure around intervention, around conflict, etc., but that hasn't really materialized in the kind of realistic and in a way that is being implemented in a realistic way. So I think they need to do that. But you also got to deal with these issues not as isolated issues, but rather synergetically.
But it's been pointed out that, of course, the upper echelons of the African Union are populated pretty much by the very people who are accused of enacting the kind of repression that is sending people fleeing from their countries. So they're basically protecting their own. We saw the African Union attempt intervention in DRC recently. It equivocated, didn't it? So really, is the AU fit for purpose?
Well, I think regional structures do exist. They have a purpose. I think we can't ignore the fact that they do have some level of limited purpose. I think what the AU does need is that it needs more than just these kinds of leaders that come in and talk about what they see as a governance structure, but don't really put their money where their mouth is. I think the AU, in the case of the DRC, also experienced the fact that the internal domestic crises and political conditions within a country just overwhelms the AU. So this AU reform that has been put together by the president of Rwanda and it needs to move forward. It needs a lot to have a particular dynamic. It needs the commitment, the confidence. The other key issue here is resources, both monetary and non-monetary. And that, I think, once you get that independence in terms of your resources, then, of course, you can start becoming much more effective in your efficacy.
Sanusha Naidu, thank you very much indeed.
Pleasure.